In 1202, a crusader army set sail from Venice, establishing a base in Egypt, and from there reclaimed Jerusalem from Christendom. However, Egypt is east. Egypt and Jerusalem are both south of Venice. Zadar, where we're going tomorrow, is east. And they sailed actually in the wrong direction, not by accident, not because of a storm. One man made that happen. Enrico Dandolo was blind, over 90 years old, and never held a sword. And before it was over, he crusade would destroy the greatest city on earth. So for the next 45 minutes, God willing, we're going to follow this old man and how he reshaped this world. But first, I want to give you a little bit of introduction into the history of the Holy Wars. Christianity, if you are familiar with it, it is a religion of peace. You know, Matthew 5:39 says, "Turn the other cheek." So they were very strict pacifists. For 300 years, they even refused the military service, and that is one of the reasons why the Romans would actually persecute them, because they didn't want to join the Roman army. So the question is, how does the pacifists ended up sacking a Christian city? Well, the shift wasn't sudden. It was actually a 1200-year shift, and starts with one man in Africa. Augustine of Hippo, he was the first one to have a moral framework for a violence. So he said to have a just war, you have to have a legitimate ruler. So it cannot be a warlord. It has to be a king or someone who's been established. It has to have a cause. So it has to be a defensive cause. If someone attacks you, you're allowed to respond. And of course, you have to have a right intent. So it has to be something that, let's say, it was reclaiming of a stolen property or something like that. So without Augustine, who came 300 years after Jesus, the Pope couldn't say God wants you to fight, but with Augustine, we have that framework starting to establish. Second thing I want to talk about is the pilgrimage to the sacred sites. So here we have Helena holding the cross of Jesus. So she was the mother of Constantine, who was the first Roman emperor who became a Christian. After his battle at the Milvian Bridge, he saw the sign of the cross, and he became a Christian emperor. He won in the sign of the cross, and his mother then went to Jerusalem, and he found all these places, and he started building these sacred sites where the European Christians would then go into pilgrimage. And in the medieval period, that was a very, very established route. People would go there all the time. And the major site was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This was seen from the east side. This is one of the stations of the cross. So he built this church, and then over the tomb of Jesus, and then it was destroyed in 1009. So right at the beginning of 11th century. Then the Eastern Roman or the Byzantines rebuilt it, and this church has a lot of pilgrims coming in. So there was kind of a break with the pilgrims going in. And then, of course, in 1054, the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church split. Both patriarchs of Constantinople and the Pope excommunicated each other. So there was a separation. And the Catholics saw the Greeks as of Christians, but a different kind of Christian, and also vice versa. So there was this opening that you can attack. So there was opening for attack. So there was they're Christians, but they're not really Christians. And so with Augustine, we have war as being permissible. We have the church saying the war can also be holy. And then what church did is they said, we're also going to give you absolution of your sins. We're going to give you so kind of like redemption for your salvation. So that basically makes the Crusades possible. So we're moving to Clermont in 1095, so at the end of the 11th century. Urban II, after the defeat of the Christian army in Anatolia, he decides to launch the First Crusade. And he says the Christians are suffering in the Holy Land, and people says Deus vult, or God wills it, and they start to believe that they are fighting for God. So the First Crusade starts in 1096 by Peter the Hermit, who rallies over 10,000 peasants. They were, of course, untrained, huge, and uncontrollable, kind of like my students sometimes. And so what they did is they did a first massacre of Jews in Rhineland. On the way down, of course, they were destroyed by the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia. Once they got there, of course, they had no military skill. And this basically kind of proves that this holy war attracts a lot of lunatics in a way, people who had no idea what they were doing. But not only those, people that were just trying to, had these visions, we also have kings. So we have the main army, the First Crusade. They started marching down through Constantinople, go down march to Anatolia, and they reach Jerusalem in July 15th. You're gonna see this kind of pattern. A lot of battles are happening in July. I don't know why, because it's the hottest, but they all go around in July. And July 15, 1099, the Jerusalem falls. There's a massacre on the street, and we have the creation of four crusader states. And of course, the problem is never really the initial conquering. The problem is the holding of the territory. So the problem with this is that there was a minority part of crusaders, and the majority was the Muslim and Jewish. And so there was a lot of rebellions, and there was constant struggle, constant survival of the war. Innocent III said we have to cut the supply lines. And so there was this four kingdom of Jerusalem, kingdom of Tripoli, Principality and County of Odessa. And if you guys see Odessa up there on the top, Odessa was the first one to fall in 1144, and the First Crusader state was lost. Of course, our European response was, we like this new territory down in the Middle East. They call for a second crusade. However, that was a giant failure and first major blow to the Europeans. So the momentum kind of stalled. However, Europeans still had the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the other states. And then the Muslims kind of came together, and they elected this ruler. You probably saw him before. His name is Saladin. And on July 4th, again, in 1187, at the Battle of Hattin. Hattin is right next to the Sea of Galilee in Israel. They joined in a battle, the Muslim army and the Crusaders, and the Crusaders were annihilated because he kind of guided them away from water. And of course, July 4th, so you need a lot of water. So Jerusalem falls a couple of months after, and 88 years of these Crusader states were gone. And what happens then? We have the Third Crusade, and there were three kings. We have the Barbarossa of Germany. He was crossing the river in Anatolia, and unfortunately he fell from his horse and he drowns. Philip of France and Richard of the Lionheart, you probably heard of him. Philip has a quarrel with Richard, and he leaves. So Richard is the only one who campaigns, and he does a very, very good job. He conquers the cities of Acre and the port cities. And he wanders around Jerusalem, but he never really attacks Jerusalem because he knows he cannot capture it. And then he made a truce with Saladin and decided for the truce was that Muslims can keep the city. However, Christians have a right to pilgrim. So basically, status quo, basically back to the default settings we had 100 years before all the Crusades. So Europe is kind of saw it was a loss. So we did a new plan. So here comes Pope Innocent III. He was a 37-year-old, even though it doesn't look like on the image. But so he was elected a 37-year-old in 1198. He was brilliant, very ambitious, and he decides to launch a new crusade. But like I mentioned in my introduction, all the crusades were going through the land. He decides to go straight to Egypt, because that is where everything is. Like the Roman Empire did not become a Roman Empire until they conquer Egypt. They have all the food's coming from Egypt. So they decided to go to Egypt first, establish a base there, and then attack Jerusalem. And also, previous crusades, they were all led by the kings and the peasant, but this time it's going to be a church-led crusade. So, and that brings us to the deal, part 2. The deal was, of course, to involve the city of Venice. The Republic of Venice. Republic of Venice was a merchant republic, so it had no king, it had elected leaders. Venice was the Adriatic Sea was their Gulf. They had a monopoly over the Adriatic Sea, and they had trade links with everyone. The Venetians were trading with everyone. The Pope actually banned the Christian cities to trade with the Muslims, but Venice did not care. They had trades with Byzantium, Constantinople, with Egypt, with Arabs, with other different crusader states. Their motto was contract over loyalty. So bringing the money in, we do not care who we do business with. And also there's a story about the cotton, because cotton came up from Indonesia out to Madagascar and then all the way up to Africa, so into Egypt, and then Europeans were having wool because that's what the English were breeding, so we had a lot of wool, and wool is very itchy. And the Venetians had these beautiful clothes because they were made out of cotton, while most of Europeans were wearing wool. But that's because Venetians had no problems trading with the Arabs. And so 6 envoys walk into Venice, and they are talking about this deal. They're explaining what they want to do. Dandolo, who was a Doge at the time, he decides, okay, let's counsel on this. It takes them a couple of days, and they come up with a decision. Dandolo understood that they are desperate and that there is no other option for them. So, since Venice is the only seller, they come up with a deal. So, Crusaders offered them 85,000 of silver marks, or Dandolo asked for 85,000 silver marks in exchange for 35,000 soldiers, 2,000 ships, 50 war galleys, and 9 months of provision. So, and of course, Venice gets half of the spoils if there's any pillaging happening. The Crusaders were reluctant to sign this, but again, since they had no alternatives. And the deadline for that was June of 1202, so and almost a year to get it done. So what does Venice do is they stop all the trade, they stop all work, and they turn into shipbuilding. So we have 27,000 crew drafted from a city of 100,000. They had a wax ball lottery. They're trying to mobilize all the possible males they have in the city. Basically, Venice put everything onto this contract. So imagine putting your whole life savings onto this contract, and the whole economy of the city was dependent on it. And if the Crusaders would not pay for this, the Venice would collapse. And again, here comes Dandolo. He was a Doge. He was a Doge. He was elected around 85 years old. He was nearly blind, and His blinding happened in the city of Constantinople because he sent an envoy to Constantinople many years ago, and there was a quarrel there, and he was most likely blinded in Constantinople, so he has something against them. However, he was seen as wise, a very influential person, probably the oldest one in Venice. And he was like a deal maker, great negotiator. However, he never held a sword in his hand. And on September 1202, at I think it was a Sunday Mass, yes, at St. Marco, the envoy kind of gathers together, and the crowd says, "We consent for sending this fleet together." And Dandolo comes up and he says, "I'm old and feeble, but no one's better than me to do this, so I'm going to be your leader or co-leader." And he says, instead of putting the cross on the back like all the other crusaders said, put it on the front of my hat, so everyone can see that I'm part of this crusade. And he becomes a co-leader or co-commander for this giant fleet. Again, there was a problem. They were expecting 33,500 crusaders. However, Venice was not that well on a good note, so other crusaders went to different cities like Genoa or Marseille. So 2/3 of the people were absent. We only have about 12,000 people coming. And because people didn't show up on time, they only raised 51,000 marks, and so they were about 34,000 short. And they even made deals, and the Crusaders even took loans out from the Venetian merchants, and that was a problem. So, not only that the Crusaders didn't have money, Venice was not getting paid. So there was and their old economy depended on this. And so we have the island of Lido. 12,000 men were stranded. There's no payment, there's no ships, nothing was happening because they didn't come up with the agreement. Disease started to spread. Again, it's the summer, and people are losing their morale. So what happens is Dandolo has a great idea. Instead of sailing for Egypt, why don't we take a short diversion to the city of Zadar, or the city of Zara at the time, because he has a personal vendetta of it. So Zadar was a city on the Adriatic coast, east of Venice. We're going there tomorrow. If you've ever been, it's absolutely spectacular. It was a Christian Catholic city. Pope was there a couple of years before. It had a Hungarian protection, but Dandolo tried to defeat it 3 times already. And he kind of convinced the Crusaders to go against this city. So here we come to part 3, the forbidden target. So Zadar was a city, again, on the Adriatic Sea. It's called Edera in the Roman times. It was a peninsula city, so it means they had water on all 3 sides. So it has a very natural defenses, so you only have to really fortify one part. It has a beautiful mountains of Velebit in the backgrounds, and again, it was protected by King Emeric of Hungary, and it had a papal protection. They had church services in Croatian language, so there was a very, very Christian Catholic city. The King Emeric of Hungary was also part of the Crusaders, so there was really no reason to go against the city, and except that it was a commercial rival to Venice. Again, it was a very rich port, and what they were doing is they were controlling the Pog, island of Pog is right across Zadar. And island of Pog is very famous for the salt mines. They're even producing salt to this day. And so what the Dandolo did is he blocked the trade sale, and he tried to avoid Zadar becoming the city of Ragusa, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow, which is the city of Dubrovnik. So that is kind of like what the background is. Dandolo tried again to conquer the city 3 times. It had impregnable walls. However, Dandolo now has 12,000 crusaders and the largest fleet ever assembled to that date. And that was his final revenge story. So 200 ships sail with 300 siege engines. They sailed down to the Dalmatian coast. They were gathering supplies on the route and heading to Zadar and not to Egypt as they originally decided to. And every mile they were sailing east, they were further away from Jerusalem and for their plans. So in October 1202, they were getting to Zadar. On their way, the Pope says, "I forbid you to attack this city." He said, "Please do not attack a Christian city. This has nothing to do with the Crusader. This has nothing to do with my plan." There were some descendants, the Franks were against it. However, there was this dilemma: should we obey our soul or should we obey our oath? So there was a dilemma. We have the descendants Simon de Montfort and Robert of Beauce. They were the ones who said they're not going to attack Zadar. And so what they did is they went ahead and they marched. They went to talk to the Zadar. They marched and told them, "We are not going to fight. The French are not going to fight. You guys need to hold the walls. The army is in collapse. It's only the Venetians who are fueling this." And because of that, they're warning the Zadar withdrew their surrender, and the siege became inevitable. So basically, their clumsy attempts forced the assault that they hoped to avoid. Basically, those Franks then kind of washed their hands, and they didn't really feel the responsibility for the attack because they were not attacking, but because they said that the Zadar is going to survive the siege, they kind of doomed the city that way. So the Crusader army arrives on November 10th, which is the eve of Saint Martin's Day. Saint Martin is a very famous holiday in Croatia. It is when the grape juice turns into wine, so it's very, very festive, except for that day. So the Crusaders came in and they saw the city, and how can this be breached? However, they established a siege camp. And what they did is they cut off the port, the chain. The port had a chain across, similar to Constantinople at the golden, I think it's golden, I forgot. It'll come back to me. So they had a chain over the harbor, and they would lift the chain so the ships could not come in and out. And when the friendly ship would come, they would lower the chain and the ships can come in. But what they did is they broke the chain and they forced the entry. They had siege machines, and they started to dug trenches to attack the city. What did the Zadar people do? The Christians in Zadar, they started hanging crosses all over the city. This is the city gates from the east side. What they were saying that we are Christians, Crusader ignored it, and basically the holy war turns on itself. So November 11 to 1124, they fought, and actually the Crusaders were rushing with this fight because they wanted to just kind of get over with, and because they know that they were doing something that was wrong. And on the feast of Saint Christonogus, or in Croatian is Saint Krševan, you can say that to kind of roll, it just rolls over the tongue, Krševan. And so that was the feast, and he was the saint, he was the protector of the city, and the city actually fell on his day. There was no sparing of lives. It was a total alienation. And what Thomas of Spalato, Thomas of Split, wrote in the book, he was current of the time, he says, there was not enough healthy men to bury the dead. The city was completely depopulated. And the centuries of building up was destroyed in a week. And then, with all the pillaging in the city, the Venetians turned against the Franks. There was a fight in between them, and about 100 people died just from the Crusader army by killing each other. So what does the Pope do? Pope says, you guys are all excommunicated. So he, first time ever in the history that the Pope excommunicated the entire Crusader army, cut them off all the sacraments, and France then blames the Venice, and they send an envoy to the Rome and to Pope, and the Pope retracted the excommunication, but the Venetians, they didn't care. So Enrico Dandolo never asked for to be forgiven of the atrocities he did. So the Crusaders then stayed in the city of Zadar in the winter, because it's not really wise to do a war in the winter when it's cool. They like to do it in July. So in the winter of 1203, they stayed in Zadar, and they have an envoy from Germany, actually, coming from Alexios. Alexios was the son of the deposed emperor of Constantinople, of the Eastern Roman Empire, and he submits a proposal of 200,000 marks and promise of 10,000 troops, and also the submission of the Eastern Orthodox Church to the Roman Church, if they put Alexios on the throne. So that is what he promised them. So instead of again going to Egypt, then to Jerusalem, they got a new offer. However, only 12 barons signed this, and we are moving on to, so this is the golden ducats or the golden coins at the time, and we are moving to Constantinople. So they crossed the Rubicon. Rubicon is when the Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Basically, they already crossed the barrier. They survived the excommunication. They sacked the Christian city. What is another one? So Zadar was basically just a warm-up. They established this new pattern. We have debt, we got a deal, and then we have an attack to cover our debt. So they're sailing down from Venice to Zara. They stop at Corfu. They also have a little disarray. We don't know who's going to stay, who's not going to stay. The army barely is still together. What they did is they said, please stay until end of August together, and then you can go wherever you like. They arrive on June 23rd to Constantinople, and they anchor at St. Stephen, which is a little bit further out of the city. They have around 20,000 crusaders, and the city of Constantinople at the time had about 400,000 people, and they had Theodosian's wall right over there. Theodosian's walls, or if you've ever been to Constantinople or Istanbul, they're absolutely magnificent and almost impenetrable. Triple layer defense. This city is a fortress, and again on a peninsula, much larger peninsula, so very, very hard to conquer. They had a chain going from over there to let the ships into the harbor. The little preview: when the Turks attacked Mehmed II, when he attacked the city of Constantinople in 1543, he actually had the ships carried over the land to get into the harbor. So that is how impenetrable the city was. On July, July, they're fighting in July 1203. There was a dual attack. The Franks were attacking from the land, and the Venetians were attacking from the sea. There was basically no advancement until Dandolo decided to jump on shore, and he saw the standard of Saint Mark, which looks like this, allegedly on one of the towers, and they were able to penetrate one of the towers on the walls, on the sea, and he rallied the troop, and they were able to make a breakthrough. So Alexios III, which is not the one that I've talked about, that's the one before, he flees. Isaac II was restored. This is the father of Alexios who gave the bribe. And the Crusaders basically conquered the city. They reinstated Isaac, and their Crusader was just waiting for payment. However, there was no payment coming because only half of the money was raised. So what they do is they started to take the icons from the churches, and they started melting all the gold to pay the Crusaders. Alexios was delaying the payments, and the Greeks didn't like the Crusaders being there. So what the Greeks do is they send fire ships to the Venetians at midnight. They sent 7 burning ships towards the Venetians. However, the Venetians had this, see those like hooks. They were able to divert the ships, so the Venetian fleet was saved. And we have a coup, not military coup, it was just a ruler coup. Murzaphilius seizes the throne from Alexios IV. Alexios IV was then imprisoned and eventually strangled, and Isaac II dies mysteriously as well. So Murzaphilius becomes Alexios V, the Eastern Roman emperor. And again, there was no payment, so on April 9th, it was the Monday after the Palm Sunday, so a couple of days before Easter, the Crusaders attack. Their fleet is driven to the walls. They're going all out, and the gates are smashed. And we have a cleric. His name is Peter of Armenis. He finds a breach, and he crawls through the breach. And with just a knife, his brother tried to pull him out with the legs, but he kind of shoved him off and went in, and he went with a knife onto the Greek defenders. You can imagine having a priest running you with a knife. So the defenders panicked, and they were able to take the city. What happens then was unimaginable plundering of the city. This is the best AI redemption I could have made to look friendly. So they did crazy pillaging of the churches. Some historians call it the greatest destruction in the medieval world. Of course, if you've been to Venice, you saw the plunder, the horses from the Hippodrome, which is the masterpiece of Greek sculpturing. They were taken to the Palace of St. Mark. We also have the crowns of thorns, the Jesus crown of thorns. They were sold to Louis IV, who put it into the Saint Chapelle. We have the Virgin's veil taken, the fragments of the true cross taken, so those are saints, bones of the saints, everything that's for veneration was taken out. And some of the scholars are saying the greatest crime against humanity in the Middle Ages, and a loss greater than the burning of the library of Alexandria. And here comes the saying later, better under the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's cap. So the Crusaders never, the Byzantines or the Eastern Romans never forget how bad the destruction was. Murzaphilius was then captured, and he was taken to the column. This is actually the column of Constantine. And he was taken to the column on top, and they threw him down from the column. And in a kind of prophetic way, there was a depiction of an emperor falling down and carved on the column many years before. So it kind of matched the scene of what happened. Then we have the establishment of the Venetians established a Latin kingdom, which didn't last for a very long year. And Dandolo was called the Lord of a quarter and a half. So have a complete takeover of those places. They have Nicaea, we have Trezibut, Epirus. Those are all the places that were taken by the Crusaders. And foreshadowing, like I already mentioned, on May 29th, 1453, Mehmed II, he was able to conquer Constantinople. But the reason why he was able to conquer Constantinople because the Crusaders made such a big impact and made such a big void that it was such a slow decline. So after 1,123 years, the Constantinople fell. And that was made major ripples in the Christian world, especially in Europe. And we come to our last part, which is the conclusion. So the city of Zadar survived. The survivors started to return about 2 years later, and they started rebuilding much faster. However, Venice didn't like that, so in 1216 to 1243, they started to tighten the grip, and the self-rule of Zadar was revoked, and of course, Venice started to monopolize the money, and they put a lot of taxes. They had a brief freedom in around 14th century, middle of 14th century, under the Treaty of Zadar or Treaty of Zara, under Louis of Joux, and it was sold back to Venice in the beginning of the 15th century for 100,000 ducats. So Venice is making bank. So with all this trading, and it lasted under the Venice rule until 1797. That is when Venice fell. But let's go back to Constantinople for a few moments. On June 1205, Dandolo dies. He was 97 years old. He died in Constantinople. He actually never returned to Venice. Why would he? He lived in the richest city in the world. He apparently had a strangulated hernia. I don't know what that is, but it doesn't sound good. He said it was a very painful and untreated death. And the system that he established kind of held together. However, the Latin kingdom only, I think, ended after 56 years. And of course, the Venetian networks with the Constantinople ended. So last year I was in Constantinople or Istanbul. I was walking through the second floor of Hagia Sophia because they changed the rules. They changed the rules. So I was walking and I saw this inscription, Enrico Dandolo, at the side. I was shocked. And so basically I looked into it, and it was a cenotaph. Like a cenotaph, it is an unmarked tomb which was made in the 19th century, and they were doing the renovation. However, there were some radar scanning in, I think, 2021, and they said they found a skeleton face, the shape and size how Dandolo could probably look like, facing Jerusalem. However, so we don't know if that is him still there. According to the history, he was removed when the Byzantines or the Eastern Romans conquered the city, and then when Mehmed, of course, all the people that were buried in the church were removed. But he made it to Jerusalem, and this is on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Have anyone ever been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem? So if you walk to the small gates, there's a couple of columns there. There's his name engraved, versus you can see H. Dandolo, Enrico's Dandolo, right next to the Aramaic crosses and Crusader crosses. So I did a lot of research on this, and I could not find who did this. But I think maybe he had someone pay to write his name at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, so he can say, well, not he can say, but that he was actually there. So his crusade never reached the Holy Land. However, his name did, and he is encarved there until the end of time, I guess. So thank you very much.